Hi everyone, welcome to this workshop on communicating science visually. My name is Nersesian. I am a scientist and a visual science communicator, and in 2017 I opened the first research-focused scientific illustrations and communications company in Canada called Designs That Sell. The Designs That Sell team is situated on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home.
Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsi, Kwikwetlam, Kakite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples on whose unceded traditional territories our three campuses reside.
At Designs That Sell, our mission is to provide working scientists, educators, clinicians, and communicators with efficient and accurate scientific illustration services. We also aim to empower scientists by providing them with the resources and tools to compose a practical scientific illustration confidently. Our values include teamwork, supporting trainees, equity, integrity, supporting open access, and accessible science. Today's workshop is a part of a series on social media and communications, created with support from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the BCCDC Foundation of Public Health. For today's workshops, we have three main objectives. The first is to appreciate the benefits of incorporating visuals in science communication. The second is to understand key design principles to ensure effective visual science communication. And the third is to explore ways to make visuals more inclusive and accessible. So for today, we're going to be having two sections of this workshop. The first section will go into the background of why you should consider incorporating visuals into your science communication. And the second portion of the workshop will be more of a how-to on how to use visuals in science communication. I'll also be referencing tips, resources, and tools that are available in these two publications listed here. So to start off today, we're going to be focusing on why you should consider using visuals in your social media science communication. And I'm going to give you a few reasons. The first is that incorporating visuals are more attractive than text. Visuals can pique interest, and this can help your work stand out from other work. Eye tracking studies that look at what individuals spend more time on find that images or videos are where we actually spend our time looking compared to text-based content. Visuals can also activate brain regions associated with reward and motivation. So once you actually get someone interested in what you've posted because you've incorporated a visual, we also know that visuals can help people stay more engaged. Visuals can help readers stay interested in the information. They can also evoke emotional connections. And when we talk a little bit about narratives and story building in future slides, I want us to remember that visuals are a really great way to connect emotionally with individuals as well. Visuals are also more accessible. We can make science more accessible by taking complex concepts and distilling them into visuals. Visuals can also help with transcending language barriers or jargon barriers. For example, a stop sign is a stop sign no matter where you are. Visuals are also more memorable. So when we look at studies that compare what people can remember 3 days after they've been provided information, we find that participants can retain 65% of visual information compared to just 10% of text information. This is extremely important for social media as well because visuals are more shareable. It's easily shareable both in an academic but also in an online scenario. Tweets with images, we know, receive about 150% more retweets. Facebook posts with images receive about 2.3 times more engagement. So we know that they're more attractive, they're engaging, they're memorable, and they're accessible. And we also know that this can help with sharing and disseminating information online. But the question that we get often is this actually more efficient? Does text communicate more efficiently than visuals? And the answer to that is that the human brain processes visuals 60,000 times faster than text. So in 1 minute, your brain could process 1,200 images or just 200 words, and that's for an average English reader. At Designs That Sell, we've done our own research as well. We've looked into the studies that have evaluated the use of infographics or pictograms to communicate things within a health context. So this might be adherence to medication, explaining why a patient might need this medication. And when we looked at the studies that had actually tested the use of infographics or pictograms, what we found was an overwhelming in favor of using these to help with a multitude of different outcomes. This included that 87.5 or 7 of the 8 studies we looked at had an overall improvement in comprehension. When we looked at medication adherence, we found that 17 of 23, or 74% of studies, found improvements in medication adherence or self-efficacy following infographic or pictogram incorporation. And probably most importantly, for health outcomes generally, 6 out of 6, or 100% of the studies, reported improved health outcomes. What this tells us is that if there was a medication that could have this type of efficacy at improving health outcomes, medication adherence, and comprehension, we would definitely invest in it. Visuals are extremely important for communicating health science, as well as science communication and knowledge translation. So, now that we've gone over why you should consider using visuals in your science communication, the rest of this workshop and the majority of it will focus on how to actually do that. So we're going to move in to 10 steps of effective visual science communication. The first step of science communication at any stage of any form is to establish a communication goal. Before you sit down to create a visual science communication piece or any type of science communication piece, you want to identify why you're doing it. Identify the purpose as perhaps educational, as something for raising awareness or for advocacy, or perhaps knowledge translation of something that's research and scientific jargon, and translating that into something that lay people can appreciate as well. Once you've identified the point of your visual science communication, you then want to move forward to understanding your audience. So this is a very important step within creating any science communication piece as well. Things you want to think about specifically for visuals are the language that you're using. For example, we know that if we're trying to reach out to all public in Canada, we need to aim for a grade 5 or 6 reading level. Reading level can be tested by using online tools such as the simple measure of gobbledygook index, which is a validated tool for looking at readability. This can give us information also on words to swap out. So perhaps if you're describing an image or you're labeling a component, it might provide you with some synonyms that are easier to understand. Reading level is also extremely important when you think about your specific audience. If you know that you're going to be trying to communicate to a population that is generally illiterate or of younger individuals, for example, elementary school kids, to be inclusive and to ensure that everyone can understand, you want to have redundancy between your text and your visuals. Use simple text at the appropriate reading level and accompany them with other opportunities to also understand that content independent of the text you're using. Visual cues are also extremely important to consider. When we think about the audience that we're communicating with, this might actually change some of the ways that we choose the visuals that we're representing. For example, if you were communicating with a geriatric population, consider that you're trying to share an infographic on avoiding falls. You want to make sure that the font is an appropriate size for somebody who it maybe is a little bit older in the geriatric population. So using super small font or relying on just digital means of dissemination might not be the best way to actually get this communication across. So taking into consideration where your audience is going to be engaging with this content is also super important. In addition to the font size and thinking about some of the visuals, you also want to think about the content and the context of those visuals. So if you're communicating with, let's say, a culture that often engages with a type of equipment or a type of tradition, and they're used to this type of imagery, then consider incorporating that imagery within your illustration or your science communication. Now, oftentimes it's difficult to know exactly what your audience is going to know, what their reading level is. It's hard to guess at a population level also how this is going to come across. And so what I recommend is really to understand your audience is to consider co-creation. And what I mean by that is engage with somebody who is from the population that you're trying to communicate with. You can do this by providing them stipends, or if you're already working with an existing group, having this lay committee or a committee of individuals that can review your content before it gets sent out can be extremely important. And if you have someone helping you through every step of the way, you can make sure that those decisions that are being made also reflect the best interest of the population you're trying to communicate with. This becomes extremely important when we're also communicating with populations, cultures, or individuals that we're not familiar with as the people who are designing this content. It's really hard to have an effective communication piece when you're missing that piece of understanding your audience. So the next step is to identify your key messages. And what I mean by this is picking the things you want the individuals to be walking away with. And so obviously, when we're communicating things, we, as the individuals who are trying to communicate, think that all of this content is important. But in reality, we know that people only take away about 3 main points when they engage with different content. And so identifying what those key messages are early on can again help you decide where to place emphasis, where to maybe leave out some content later down when you're swapping in visuals or incorporating different components into your science communication. When we're talking about main points and actions, it's really great to have these as the main section headings. Perhaps you have different titles or different sections that are bolded. Perhaps they have a box outlining them within your visual. And these titles or subtitles should aim to be action-oriented. This can help people, especially who are reading this visual science communication content and thinking about, let's say, an action that they can see performing in their own lives. Perhaps you're advocating for masking in certain situations. Providing that actionable title can help them visualize them doing it themselves. You also want to avoid paragraphs and break up text with different components. And these different components can be graphics. So for example, separating sections with boxes or having lines separate important sections. You also might consider using point form rather than block text. So think about ways to cut down the text as much as possible. And of course, layout can be used to also separate. So for example, using white space appropriately to separate 2 contents of text. The next step in creating an effective visual communication is to develop your story. As we spoke about earlier, visuals can really help with making emotional connections. They're extremely important for activating that part of our reward system in our brain. And so when we're creating visual communications, it's the same as any type of science communication. If we can make emotional connections, then we can have more effective and meaningful communication. And so for visual science communication, you want to also think about what story you're telling. And the visuals can be built and weaved into the story early on. Once you know your audience, you've identified your goal, and you have your key messages, think about how to pull these things together to make a relatable experience or story with characters perhaps, and think about this narrative in the context of your audience. Once you have this narrative together, you might think about, what are the characters and how can we make them relatable? What is the challenge and what are those solutions? So in any good story, you walk away with the conclusion. This is really where you can emphasize your key points as well. And when you're also creating this story, you want to think about how you can interweave that impact and relevance to your audience within the narrative. The next step to creating a visual is actually laying out your content. And so what I always recommend is to figure out the dimensions you're working with. So what's the canvas that you're creating your visual science communication on? This can be easily found if you're posting it on social media by simply Googling the platform, and it will provide you with the up-to-date dimensions of those different social media images. Once you have the dimensions set up in your favorite platform, I've listed a few here that are user-friendly at different levels of experience. So we have two different main types of illustration content creation, where one of them is drag and drop. Drag and drop platforms like Canva, Venngage, or BioRender allow you to select components that are already illustrated from a bank of illustrations or images. And so these allow you to pick what you'd like, drop them into your canvas, and use them in that way. There's also creation-based platforms. These are for individuals and people who are interested in actually making their own visual element. So if you'd like to illustrate out a concept, create an icon, have a custom illustration, these platforms are for you. Within each of these categories of platforms, there's also two important formats of these illustrations you'll receive at the end. So when we talk about exporting images, there are vector or raster options. Vector options are essentially equations, and so by scaling them up, we actually don't lose any resolution. When we talk about raster images, these are pixel-based, and so when we blow them up, for example, if you were printing an illustration on a scientific poster to present at a conference, you wouldn't want to use a raster image, as those pixels would essentially make it pixelated as it expands. And so depending on the platform that you have and are available, you always want to try for a vector if possible. And if not, then raster is a great option too. When we're talking about laying out your content, now that you've picked the platform that you're going to be working with, and you've also created your dimensions, you understand what canvas you're working with, you want to start laying out your content, so those different components of your story, your main takeaways, and the things you're thinking about incorporating as visuals, as placeholders. And I always recommend doing this on a grid. So on that blank canvas you have, plop on any type of grid. You can simply Google a grid. And what this will help you is stick to some graphic design principles. So we're going to be walking through these ABCs of graphic design, and we're going to be highlighting things like alignment, which is making sure things line up, balance or distributing content evenly, contrast, which will help guide the reader through and help them understand what's important, consistency, so making sure things like method of contrast stay consistent throughout, and directionality, making sure that your different components, your story has a flow to it that allows people to follow along through it. So we'll start with alignment. Alignment is extremely important to make sure that people aren't spending time on trying to figure out how your components relate to each other. When we engage with the visual science communication piece, we want to try to minimize cognitive load. This is the amount of time and the amount of energy your brain has to put into understanding something. If the brain has to put an energy into understanding how the different components relate to each other, it takes away from them understanding the actual content. So to ensure that individuals are focused on the content that you're trying to communicate rather than trying to understand how your content relates to each other, you want to use alignment. And you want to ensure your different components are aligned both horizontally and vertically. What I mean by this is in most platforms, you'll find an alignment tool. This alignment tool will say align horizontally or vertically. When you have different components in your illustration, for example, different subtitles or 3 different images or icons, you can use this opportunity to align the different components to allow people to quickly understand the difference between that title and that illustrated content. And once they've done that once, they can apply it to the rest. And so alignment is extremely important for helping our brain lower cognitive load and focus on the content rather than how the content is laid out. Balance is equally important and also performs the same function as alignment. When we're talking about balance, you want to make sure the different components in your illustration or your visual are equally balanced. And what I mean by that is that they're separated by the same amount of white space. If you have illustrations that are a bunch of different sizes and it's difficult to make this equal, a really great opportunity is then to create bounding boxes or shapes like in the illustration here, where you can then understand and separate those boxes by the same amount of space. And for distributing objects, you again want to make sure you're considering that horizontally as well as vertically. In addition to balancing the actual spacing between your components, balance is also important to consider when you're thinking about the type of content you're placing. For example, if you had a figure that was horizontally laid out like a PowerPoint, And on half the PowerPoint on the left, you had a visual or an illustration. And the entire right side of that PowerPoint is all text. That actually means that your visual piece is really restricted to the left side, and that text could be used as a standalone. What you want to be doing is interweaving your text through visuals. So you should have a balance of this visual and text communication throughout your visual science communication piece. You want to try to avoid having sections of your visual that are heavy in just illustrations or just text if you can. The next thing we'll talk about is contrast. What I mean by contrast is either headers, guiding points, or perhaps there's a really important cycle that you want to emphasize within your research. So what you want to focus on here is picking a method of contrast. What I mean by this is how are you going to actually highlight those components? How are you going to let them know that the title is different from the content? This allows readers and helps them with moving through the piece. And again, we're reducing cognitive load when we easily can identify where to start and where to move through. So when you pick a method of contrast, which there are many different options, you could consider using bolded text. So taking the text family that you used and using the bolded or semi-bolded version as a title to differentiate that. You could also increase font size. This could also be used for important considerations when you're labeling types of illustrations or visuals, or you might consider changing the colors of the titles to differentiate them from the text. You also might consider using a shape, for example, a blocked color, as in this example. And you can also consider just using bounding boxes as well. There are a lot of different options for contrast, so pick one that works with your style and stands out to you. And the next point is consistency. So whatever you do pick, ensure that you're keeping that the same. So what we mean by this is if your title is being highlighted in a certain way or your subtitles are being differentiated from your text, ensure that you're keeping this consistent throughout your visual communication. This also stays the same for any text you're using. Consistency is extremely important, again, for reducing cognitive load because we want people to focus on the content rather than trying to understand how the content relates to each other. And so on the left, we see that the title is the same, the subtitle and the contrast used to actually differentiate the subtitle are the same as well. On the right, you see that there's different text. The subtitles are not as easily differentiated because it's not consistent. And there's not really any understandable relationship between these different components. So having consistency, again, is extremely important, not just for aesthetics, but also for that effective communication. And the next point we already talked about a little bit, which is directionality. Directionality is extremely important for any visual piece you're putting together. In Western culture, we typically start from the top left and we move down to the bottom right. However, there's a lot of alternate kinds of flows and directionality within visuals that we're already used to. So while the most common is top left to bottom right, here are some other options that you might consider for flow of your content. The next step, once you've actually laid out your content. So at this point, you have a grid. You've incorporated titles, you've incorporated placeholders, perhaps for images. So you might say, I'm going to have illustration icon A, B, and C laid out here. The next step is to actually decide what style you're going to move forward with. So you have your content. How are you going to actually make it look aesthetic and put it together? The first thing you want to do is build a color palette. This is a really fun part for people who love to experiment with colors, but for some it can be daunting and they'd like just a recipe of how to do it. So I'll provide two options for you here today. The first are some tips just generally when you're creating color palettes. If you're doing something medical or health communications related, keep it physiologically representative. People are used to seeing blood as red. Switching it up to using a purple color or a green color can indicate that something is off. It also is physiologically unsettling when we view visuals that are different from what we're trying to understand. So again, to reduce cognitive load and have that be effective, use the simplest physiologic color that people are used to seeing and can easily recognize so that we can contextualize that visual quickly and understand the content that's trying to be communicated. When it comes to creating a color palette, you also want to consider variety. You want to ensure that you have a light color as well as a dark color, and if possible, some color highlight options. And what this will allow you to do is refer back to that color palette and pick the content that looks most appropriate for your style. So for example, if you had two highlight colors, you could try either option to differentiate and contrast in one instance, for example, your titles. or labels that you want to highlight. When you're also creating color palettes, it's important to keep accessibility in mind here. Using accessibility tools like contrast checkers or ensuring that your palette is colorblind safe are easily done online, and I'll provide some resources for that. Another important thing to consider is perhaps incorporating color patterns on top of colors. So what I mean by that is if perhaps you're showing a bar graph of different information and you have two different colored bars that are consistent throughout, consider adding a pattern on top of those bars. What this allows you to do is then if someone is able to only visualize some colors, or if someone, let's say, prints out this illustration or visual on a black and white printer, it can allow them to understand that difference and consistency independent of just color. Another important thing here to avoid is overlapping colors. And so the more complex your illustrations, your styles, your visuals, for example, a picture is, the more easily you're probably going to encounter colors overlapping with each other. Keeping things simple, using one color when you can, will help with accessibility as well here, even if you're unsure if your color palette is actually colorblind safe. You build a color palette if you're creative and you'd like to actually explore. So there's different opportunities here like coolers, which provides you with a palette that you can automatically generate different components or hold certain colors steady while you test out some different random colors. This is really great for creatives who want to explore different options. There are also different places where you can go to obtain the different codes for colors. Depending on the program that you're using, the input might look a little bit different and might be referred to things like RGB or hex codes. Using a platform like Color Hexa will allow you to get all that information for a specific color that's web friendly. There are also other tools for colors and selecting color palettes that you might consider using, including Color Hunt, which essentially you can browse through a bunch of pre-established color palettes and pick one that might match the style that you're going for your visual science communication. Once you have your color palette and you've picked a variety of them, you then move on to select the type of fonts that you might be using. When we talk about fonts, we often in communication talk about typographic efficiency, and this is the rate and readability of the text that you're using. So how fast and clearly someone can move through that text in that font. When we're using different types of fonts, there's often two main categories. The first is sans serif, and the most common example of that is Arial. These fonts don't have little edges to the ends of the fonts that the other category, serif fonts, do. Serif fonts on each of those letters have little caps and lines at the ends of each of their letters. So you can appreciate the common example of that being Times or Times New Roman. Comparing Arial and Times, when we look at sans serif versus serif fonts, we know that for style, these serif fonts feel more classic, more professional. In terms of sans serif fonts, we approach them as more modern and approachable. And when we look at typographic efficiency, so how someone can move through that text and how easily it's understandable, we see that sans serif fonts are more typographically efficient than serif fonts. So for your visual science communication, it's often recommended to try to go for a sans serif font. So when you should use it all the time. There is one exception for when serif fonts can outperform sans serif fonts for typographic efficiency, and the only case where that happens is when you have text that is very small. So a common example I give is when you're presenting an academic poster and you have figure captions that are quite small to help with readability there. That's really the only appropriate time to use serif fonts. Deciding on fonts can often be like deciding on your colors. You can put in a lot of effort and creativity in coming up with different font combinations. However, sometimes it's easy just to pick a serif font, sans serif font, and go with the different options from that font family. So what I mean by that is, as you can see in A here, there are different families of fonts. So for example, we can look at Myriad or Arial or Poppins or Avenir, and these different fonts allow you to pick different styles of font, which might include, for example, a title. You can use the black version of that font, which is the most bolded and thick version. And then you can use a bold italic of that same font family, which is a little bit differentiated. It's a little bit skinnier than the black font, but it's also more bold than the plain font. And then using that regular font for the body of your text. So here are some examples in section A of using that same font family in the different 3 options. So you can easily tell which font family have those options, as when you go into the platform, essentially some will have different categories while others might have a few different bolded options. Now, if you are more creative and you want to explore using different fonts, what I would recommend is using a header with lots of personality. That is something that looks quite different, might deviate from the classic fonts that we're used to. And that allows you to kind of exercise creativity there without really affecting the readability or communication of your piece. The subtitle can have some personality, so you're aiming for something in the middle, and then you want your body text to be as plain as possible. This allows for clear communication and readability in any place where you might have more than a few words of text together. And again, you want to avoid paragraphs. Consider breaking up text into smaller components using things like point form, graphics, or white space as well. A really great resource for finding different fonts if you feel like being creative and exploring different options is Google Fonts, which has thousands of options, and a lot of them are free for you to download and use in your own projects. So now that you have a style and you have a color palette and you know which fonts you're using and you've already laid out your content, the next step is to actually swap in visuals for those placeholders. Whether you're illustrating components yourself or using a drag and drop platform, you want to go for the simplest type of image that matches the style of your illustration. For example, here, we're talking about icons as one color, 2-dimensional types of line drawings. These are some resources that you can visit to access free icons, including the Noun Project or Philoptic. The next level up from icons are graphics. Graphics might have a few different colors, and they're still 2-dimensional, and these are still very simple and quick to understand. Some examples of where you can find graphics include Servier art or bio icons. The next level of complexity from there is illustrations. Illustrations have different components, additional colors. They sometimes also will include things like highlights and shadows to provide additional dimensionality. Essentially, it's giving you a step closer to reality on top of what graphics would. An example of where you might find some illustrations include the Public Health Image Library. And lastly, if you have no other options, if you're showing something that needs to be taken within the real context of that object, then you can use pictures. Obviously, pictures are the most complex. They're going to take the brain the most time to understand and contextualize. And an example of a resource where you might find applicable pictures includes MetPix. Whatever type of image or illustration that you're going to be using for your piece, whether you're making it yourself or whether you're finding it online, you want to make sure that it matches that style that you've chosen. So make sure that you can change the colors of those objects, or you can match the colors to the color theme that you've decided on that color palette. And another additional thing to consider if you're using images that you haven't created yourself is to ensure the copyright status of those illustrations, icons, or graphics. It's really easy to find the copyright status of illustrations you find online, as they often accompany them when you click into them from different image banks or different databases. If you're unsure about the copyright status of an illustration, it's likely that it is copyrighted, and assume it is, so work with the ones that you're able to confirm are free and copyright free. The next step is to take your whole illustration that you've created, so your visual science communication piece. You had the layout, you've now swapped in for visuals that match your style, you've updated the fonts to match the styles that you like, and now it's time to look at your piece and simplify and label the different components. Is there anything that needs additional context? For example, a graphic or an icon that might be unclear that could benefit from having an additional label or a text associated with it. When you're labeling, an important thing to consider for graphic design is to keep the weight of those labels or arrows or any type of line that you have consistent unless you're trying to show a difference. So for example, if you're trying to show two pathways where one option of the pathway is dominated over the other, then it might make sense to make that arrow or line bigger. However, if you're trying to show equal, in terms of hierarchy, equal labeling of your different components, you want to make sure that those lines are equal as well. And another tip here for most effective communication is to also ensure that those labels are lined up. So if you're going to be labeling to the right or the left of your illustration, have them left or right aligned respectively. Another important consideration is the angles that you're going to be labeling your lines with. It's most effective for our brains to understand labeling that is done either at a 90-degree or 45-degree angle. And whatever method you're using, try to keep it consistent between your labels. Another important consideration for lines or labels is to ensure that they're not overlapping. You want to keep all these lines separated. If you absolutely need to overlap, then consider using two different colors of lines or two different patterns. For example, a dotted line and a flat line. So this finally brings us to the last step in creating your effective visual science communication piece, which is to actually pilot test it. The best way to pilot test your communication is to identify someone in the audience who you're trying to communicate with and get them to review the piece for what they get out of it. You can also provide them with directed questions to get feedback, which we'll go through in a second. But to start off, I just want to give an example of what this might look like. When we were working with one of our clients at Designs That Sell, we provided an infographic that was then reviewed by some of the people who would actually be engaging with this infographic in real life. And two things that we were open to changing included the text as well as some of the content that we had illustrated. And in fact, we got feedback on both of these things. So for example, the audience that we were trying to communicate with preferred the terms individual over clients. In addition to this, they pointed out that the physician was wearing a white coat, which might have emphasized a power dynamic between the individuals as well as the physician. And so in this improved version, and revision, we were able to then remove the white coat, still able to show that it was a physician through a name tag as well as a clipboard, and we also changed some of the language that we had originally incorporated. Being open to these changes is extremely important, and also following up with the recommended changes for which that audience has suggested. So how do you actually go about getting feedback? We also performed at Designs That Sell our own research project where we wanted to test the development of a visual recurrence prevention tool in the setting of alcohol rehabilitation in Ontario. So this is now published, but I'll walk you through some of the questions that we asked once we created this infographic, what we considered were important things to get feedback on, so you can incorporate some of these questions into your own pilot testing. And so what we did here was a full study where we surveyed the Canadian Addiction Counselors Certification Federation between October 2020 and January 2021. This included residential programs, private practices, as well as community-based agencies. And we worked with the service users with addiction issues, individuals who had been engaging with them for a mean of 16 and a half years. And so these individuals who we'd been surveying, obviously we didn't want to ask those within the alcohol rehabilitation programs. However, those who administer those programs are a great substitute for that audience to provide us with effective feedback on what they think might be most effective for communicating this. And so when we were putting together these questions, we wanted to think about the main components of our visual communication, break them down into different sections, and ask specific questions to get feedback on those sections. The first thing we wanted to look at was overall effectiveness. So was the infographic well suited and effective at communicating the main messages we were trying to get across? As you can see here, we provided them with a scale, a Likert scale of opportunities to either strongly disagree as a 1 or strongly agree as a 5 to what they were seeing. And as you can see here, we asked questions about the handout being effective at communicating the relapse prevention model, if the handout was appropriate in an alcohol misuse treatment, if it was well suited for the intended audience, which is obviously the service users, and if the information in the handout would benefit an addiction treatment service. So we essentially asked, is this going to actually be used and be useful within that setting? We also asked questions about the content. So we wanted to know, did we select the right information to communicate? Here we asked things like, did the handout define high-risk situations in a clear and concise manner? Did the handout offer good avoidance and coping strategies? Did the handout promote self-efficacy as well? All actions that were presented in the handout are reasonable, where the behaviors a service user could actually accommodate. So these questions were really important for understanding. And obviously, the questions that you might ask during a pilot test are going to be unique to the communication tool that you're creating, but I hope this gives you some suggestions for questions around content that you might consider asking. We also asked questions about cognitive load as well as organization and layout. So we wanted to know, did the handout present information clearly? And did it organize content well for the people who might be using it? We also asked questions about writing style. We wanted to know if the handout used appropriate language when dealing with alcohol and alcohol misuse. We also wanted to know if the text contained any jargon and if it could easily be understood by the service users. And finally, we wanted feedback on the visuals or the illustrations. Did the pictures and drawings on the handout, were they appropriate for alcohol misuse treatment? And were there any concerns that some of the images might actually trigger any cravings in some of the service users? So these altogether were the questions we asked. We also, importantly, had an open-ended question that allowed people to freely give us feedback on any component of the illustration. This is extremely important because you might have specific questions that you're asking. However, they may have feedback that falls outside of these questions that might be able to improve your visual tool. So here we had both positive and negative feedback, constructive feedback to help improve our visual tool, including that it might be too busy. We had a few individuals talk about boredom being included as a trigger, talking about the individualization of those triggers, and recognizing that avoidance techniques might be unattainable to some people. They also liked that they could empower service users, it could promote self-efficacy, it could be used in many settings, the visuals were simple, and it was appropriate for a target audience. So taking that into consideration, we made several changes to the original infographic. We took all the points that they had incorporated, as well as the feedback on the infographic altogether, and made additional changes that reflected what that audience had wanted. So altogether today, we talked about visuals in science communication. We focused on why you might consider using visuals, including the fact that they're more attractive, engaging, accessible, memorable, shareable, and efficient. We also went through 10 simple steps to actually creating a visual science communication. So you want to be considering your goal and your audience, the content and the story that you're putting together, how you're laying out your visual, the organization, and think about ways to incorporate color and font to be accessible. I want to thank the team at Designs That Sell that contributed to this presentation, more specifically Sean and Abdullah, who led the research projects that I had mentioned in this presentation, as well as Naomi, who was the main illustrator for most of these different components and projects. If there are any follow-up questions, I've also listed our email here, as well as our handle for social media. Please reach out to Designs That Sell if you have any science visual communication needs, if you'd like a consultation, or if you have any follow-up questions from this presentation. Thank you so much for listening and for tuning in. And again, thank you to our sponsors for providing support for this workshop, including the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, as well as the BCCDC Foundation for Public Health.